Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Essential Chat with Mit. And this month, for Black History Month, we're going to have a show that's related to the voices and concerns of emerging Black and Brown social work voices. But before we do that, I'd like to. This has been a really busy month, and all of us have had our feelings and emotions. Every day it changes, and we're no different on this show. We lost a great person, an NASW pioneer. All of you know that Dr. Ruby Gourdine passed away, and today was her homegoing services. And unfortunately, because we had this show, we knew that Dr. Gourdine would want the show to go on. We are going to be highlighting the Howard University Social Work, Social Justice Fellows. And I a- actually serve as a distinguished professor from because of John and Barbara Jacob at Howard University. So we're going to have the Howard University Choir play the song for the day, which is appropriate for Dr. Gourdine, appropriate for Black History Month. I ask you all, in your moment of silence, as we play this song, to think of these words and think of the subject matter we're dealing with today. So I'm going to ask for all the other guests just to sit by for a minute, and I want to talk to NASW for just a minute. So I'll bring you back on in a minute. NASW has been working really, really hard this week because every day a news event occurs that we must respond to because of our code of ethics. The first one I will speak about, and these statements are from NASW, is NASW stands with social workers across the globe in denouncing the war that Putin has started in Ukraine. Innocent lives are being lost because of Putin's lust for power, control, and his hateful rhetoric. Social workers know firsthand the devastating impact war has on people's lives. Also, I want you to know that NASW condemns Governor Abbott's direction of Texas Department Family and Protective Services to implement Attorney General Paxton's opinion and to teach and to actually treat age appropriate, medically necessary, gender affirming treatment as child abuse. Texas' attempt to change the definition of child abuse are in direct opposition of social work values, principles, and our code of ethics. And most importantly, they pose danger to transgender youth and their families. Governor Abbott's directive is discriminatory, unjust, and directly targets transgendered and gender expansive youth. NASW wants Texas leadership to understand that social workers across this nation support transgender youth, their families, and their support systems. Gender affirming care must be viewed for what it is: life saving and life affirming health and mental health care. Governor Abbott's direction sends an alarming message to kids and families across the country that will only further exacerbate transphobic discrimination, stereotyping, and bullying already experienced by trans youth and children. Social workers across this country are rising up, and you must too, to stand up against this directive. NASW uh, is against the directive and will take all necessary steps to oppose any implementation or enforcement of these unjust rules. To the transgender and gender expansive youth, children, and adults that are struggling and hurting in this moment, please know that we hear you, we see you, and we support you. NASW stands in solidarity with you and will continue to uplift transgender rights as human rights. You see, everything that has occurred this week and that has been in the news relates to the subject matter we're going to discuss today. It relates to voting. Governor Abbott is running as a governor. Governor DeSantis is running, who came out with a crazy policy of do not say get gay. The Minnesota verdict of Kim Potter, where a jury found her guilty. The judge that approved or gave out that sentence of only 2 years. Judges are elected by their constituents. We also know that Ahmaud Arbery and those officers who stood by and allowed the death or the murder of George Floyd to occur without any medical assistance, both of them were charged as well, one under the federal hate crimes bill and the other by federal court yesterday. Federal judges are appointed by the president that you elect. And yes, just this morning, we know that Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson was nominated to the Supreme Court of the United States by President Joseph R. Biden. And he is elected by you. So when we talk about voting and we talk about not voting, everything that we mention happens locally. Those actually school board members that are putting through policies of burning books and taking books out of the library, they're elected by their constituents. The judges are elected in their states by their constituents. The governors are elected by their constituents. And all the federal court is appointed by the president. So today, we know Dr. Gourdine would want us to talk to you all about voting and about those emerging voices that are going to protect our right to vote. Voter nullification, voter suppression, and gerrymandering is occurring in every state in the United States. So we started with the Ukraine war. We talked about Governor Abbott's hateful policies. And I am so proud to know that I am standing in front of a class the Howard University Social Work Social Justice Fellows, whose whole charge is to be leaders in social justice when they graduate from HU. So I am going to take a rest today, although I may interject from time to time. I want to hear from the emerging voices. I was lucky enough to have a Howard University student intern this year by the name of Karessa Proctor. And we're going to change seats. I'm going to take the grandmama seat and I'm going to let her actually facilitate this discussion with her colleagues. And I am so proud of what they have to say. Please write in the chat the questions that you have. We have brown and black voices on here that will be giving you their opinions. They are from Howard University, and all of them are unique and have unique experiences. So, with that said, Karessa, I turn this essential chat that is dedicated to one of our faculty members, Dr. Ruby Gourdine, over to you. Break a leg.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Professor Joyner. It has been such an honor to be learning under the direction of a social work pioneer. Today, I have with me 5 out of the 8 fellows, as I like to call them. We are part of the inaugural 2021 to 2022 John E. and Barbara S. Jacob Social Work and Social Justice Fellows at Howard University. We have been selected to participate in a 6-month interactive learning and practice collaboration to conduct research on social work and social justice leadership. We aim to examine the future of social work's profession and its commitment to social justice and the intersections of equality, anti-racism, social well-being, and the social determinants in tradition and non-tradition social work practice settings. Yesterday, we decided that as a fellowship, we needed to come together and address the horrendous Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, as well as Governor Greg Abbott's direction of the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services to out, report, and to remove trans children from their parents' custodies. We are firm in the belief that LGBTQIA+ youth should be protected and they should be valued. Today, we decided to gather together to utilize our voices to talk about the concerns that we have surrounding voting, advocate for the issues at hand, and ask ourselves where social work comes into play. To amplify these Howard-educated voices, I will ask my peers to introduce themselves and state what they have done to involve themselves with voting, starting with Simone.
Greetings, everyone. Happy Black History Month. I'm Simone Akila Ruskamp. As we mentioned, really honored to be here with Professor Joyner, also representing Howard University. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm also one of the co-founders of Healing Justice Santa Barbara, where I lead a Black-centered and femme-led movement, right? Because we are a people of many, many strategies. And I'm looking forward to talking about one of those strategies, voting, in partnership with my colleagues today.
Thank you, Simone. I'll move on to Sasha.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sasha Estrada. I'm a second-year MSW candidate, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'm so excited to be able to engage in this conversation as a second-generation immigrant and first-time voter.
Thank you, Sasha. Brianna?
Hi, everyone. My name is Brianna Robinson. My pronouns are she and her. I'm also a second-year Master of Social Work degree candidate at Howard University with my concentration in community administration and policy practice. My interests are focusing on lobbying and advocating for youth rights through policymaking and litigation, and I have a special emphasis on wanting to protect youth in regard to privacy, health, and childhood sexual assault.
Thank you, Brianna. And to showcase that chivalry is not dead, Kevin.
I love it. Hello, everyone. So my name is Kevin S. Thomas. I'm a second-year MSW MBA candidate here at Howard University. I'm also the founder of the Thomas Foundation, which is a DC-based community organization just geared towards encouraging people to be civically engaged and use their talents and gifts to make their communities better. And so I'm excited to be here today.
Thank you, Kevin. And I've asked, so much of all of you during the past month, but I wanted to highlight all the efforts that you specifically did. Simone came up with an amazing and beautifully written fact sheet. So do you mind talking about that a little bit?
Yes, sure. So hi, Simone again. And I realize I didn't give a visual description, so I want to make sure to do that just in support of disability justice. So I am a dark-skinned Black woman, and I have locks around to my chin. I'll briefly go over the one-pager that we prepared just around voting rights, but also just the history of Black folks exercising, organizing, mobilizing of their communities to actually exercise full citizenship. And so partnering with different sources from CNN, but also the NAACP, I thought it would be helpful just to remind all of us of the many strategies that have been used by, in particular, I'll just say my ancestors, right, to claim these rights. So we know that in 1776 to 1789, that voting was really restricted to white landowners, in particular men. And so if we think about how people are able to vote, it always has been attached to this idea of privilege, but also the idea of keeping certain folks who might be more oppressed, have experiences of marginalization, away from really having their voices uplifted. We know that the 15th Amendment in 1870 expanded that right in words, but we know that there were many barriers created to actually prevent all of the different folks that make up the United States from exercising the right. We know that in 1920, the 19th Amendment, which extended the right to vote to white women, did not include women like myself or some of the wonderful, beautiful women on this screen. And then we know in 1965, and again, I think it's important for us to always remember that the gains of 1965 were only received or realized because of the work of organizing through folks like Martin Luther King Jr., but also in giving credit to Children's Defense Fund and many other organizers, especially in Mississippi, and organizing around freedom schools and talking about the right to vote, encouraging people to exercise their rights, that we have the monumental Voting Rights Act, right, which banned literacy tests and other discriminatory barriers meant to prevent and deter Black folks from voting. And so I think what we see when we look at the history is that every time there has been a gain, which has been painfully won by organizers in communities, by families, there also has been organizing to take us several steps back. And I think what we'll see in the discussion that we have today, and even with the opening that Professor Joyner provided to us, right, is that there are still, in the time that we are in now, many modern threats for Black and Brown voters to exercise their rights. And if we think about those who are most impacted, right, so who are most marginalized, and again, if we're centering trans folks, if we think about Black and Brown trans folks, we have to make sure that we're preserving our access and actually exercising our right to vote.
Thank you so much, Simone. That was incredibly powerful. And it just, made me think about a lot of things. Specifically today, are there any barriers as young Black and Brown voters that we're experiencing right now when you try to vote?
So I'm happy to share some of mine, and I know some of my colleagues, in particular, Sasha, Brianna, and Thomas want to add in here as well. But I would say one that was really difficult for me, especially as someone wanting to vote, excited, and also really, really blessed to have inherited a legacy of Black voters. So I shared with these lovely folks that my grandfather It was like, it was religious to him, right? To work at the polls, to encourage people, not on how to vote, but just to show up, right? And to see this friendly face of another Black person there, just saying, I'm so proud of you to be here, right? But even with that legacy, I was nervous. So I actually brought my daughter, who was an infant at the time. And in my head, I was like, oh my goodness, might folks judge me? Might I have to show my ID? I was worried about all these things that might come up. Now, luckily, I still went, but I acknowledge that so many other parenting people may stay in that place of, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do this, right? I don't have the supports to go. And I was able to vote and felt really affirmed in doing so. But I think as we talk about widening access to voting, what would it look like if we were to support childcare for parenting folks to be able to exercise their rights? What would that mean for policies that impact parenting people and children, especially with what we talked about earlier today? So I think with that, I would love to pass it off to some of my other colleagues to hear about their experiences as well.
Sure, I'll take a shot at it. So my first time voting when I turned 18 was for President Obama, which was an honor, just to say the least, to be able to vote and make history in my first time at the ballot box. I never really experienced any physical barriers to voting. My barrier probably was more so just having knowledge of each candidate. Of course, at that time, Barack Obama was probably the most popular man on the planet. And so it was very easy to at least understand what he was about. But as we know, voting is important down the ballot. We can't just focus on the presidential elections. We have to worry about, the congressional level and down, all the way down to the local offices. Those are the offices that affect our daily lives. And so typically, your first time voting, you're going to probably align more so with your family, or at least depend on them to kind of school you on who is about what and who you should vote for. And so I relied heavily on my mom to kind of give me the scoop on who was for what and who I should vote for. And as I got older, I started to be able to do my own research and know how to really do a thorough search on online or whatever resources to find out what each candidate was about.
For me, my first time voting, the barrier that I faced was my parents are from Mexico. They aren't able to vote. So it was really my first time voting. I feel like I kind of went in blind in the sense of I had to navigate this whole voter registration, voting process on my own. How do I find my polling place? How do I register to vote? Do I have to update that? And then especially in terms of what political candidate would I be casting my vote for? I remember specifically for the 2016 election, I was just a month shy of being able to vote in that election, but thinking about and in terms of learning from my high school teachers in terms of how that process looked like in such an intense election. And so when I was finally able to vote the following year after for a midterm election in my hometown state of New Jersey, being able to compile that information in an important election, even if it was just for like my district, I think voting is important on all levels. What type of candidate information I was registered to vote, and then kind of showing that also to my other family members who would be voting for the first time.
I know for myself, luckily I haven't experienced any physical barriers to voting. My first experience was kind of more of a celebration, a party amongst other freshmen students. When I was starting out in the dorms, we had a pizza party and everyone was encouraged to vote. The environment around where I went to school was all around just voting, get elected, make sure you have your registered, make sure you're going to the polls. So luckily I haven't had that experience, but I do know from close friends of mine, actually there was someone in particular, they're a Black immigrant. And so unfortunately, DACA recipients, they were a DACA recipient and they're not eligible to participate in federal elections, depending on states and some municipalities, like for example, San Francisco, they may be able to participate in elections on a lower level, but in terms of federal that's just not something that they're able to do. And so kind of looking at humbling myself in terms of, being able to have that privilege to vote, but also seeing what ways can I raise the voices of those that do not have that opportunity to vote, making sure that we're having discussions, making sure we're looking at the issues that they're also concerned about and uplifting it. For example, protecting DACA, because we know a couple years ago that was something that was being challenged. And so making sure that as young people, as young Black and brown voters, that we're uplifting others within our communities and making sure that we're all, staying upright, we're looking out for each other.
Right. And thank you all for sharing your various experiences. I think it's really important to highlight. For me, I think my main barrier was my time and my resources. So I, 18 years old, I was super excited to vote. I was going to get out there and vote for a woman, do all of that. And I realized that I had to work that same day. And I was like, well, I want to get there. I want to do what I need to do. This is my first time. I'm really excited about it. But I also was concerned of I can't take an entire day off to, go out there and vote for maybe an hour, which was my thinking at the time, because I have bills to pay. I can't rely on parents or family members. And I also was like, I have to buy these textbooks that I ended up only cracking once, unfortunately, in my undergrad career. But it was just it was very troublesome because I thought that, this one was so important and I needed to get out there. But I had to make the decision of okay, let's get up at 5 a.m. and take myself down to that polling station. And I unfortunately couldn't afford a car at the time either. So I ended up spending over $40. And I think I accidentally put that on my mom's card. So there was a lot of issues that day in general. And unfortunately, the election didn't turn out the way that I wanted it to go. So I was stuck feeling was my voice heard? Did it matter? And, will I do that again if it's not going to turn out to be the way that I am? Obviously, I've, reached a lot more education now, but as an 18-year-old girl, that's what I was thinking of at the time. So it also got me to thinking, do you believe that voting is the best way to make your voices heard?
Yeah, I think, Karessa, to some of what you mentioned, it highlights the need for policies, right? Because again, if we're wanting to widen the access, if we want more people to be able to vote, if we want more voices to have input on local and federal government, we need to make sure that election day is a holiday, right? So that people aren't having to try to negotiate with their employers, which may go well or less well, depending on where you are, right? If we think about the number of Black and brown folks who are in service positions, so maybe they're not able to, do something virtually or whatever, where they're in line, we have to make sure that they're protected and able to take that time away from their jobs and be compensated to actually vote. So I think to that, I would say, I know I mentioned earlier, right, that I believe as Black folks, we're people of many, many strategies. And I think voting is one of those strategies. And as we saw on the timeline, right, it's a strategy that also was won because of folks organizing. So I don't think voting can happen without political education within our families, within our communities. It can't happen without organizers also thinking about ways to make sure that folks have transportation to the polls and feel safe there, right? So something I'm super proud of about Healing Justice Santa Barbara is that we saw some of these barriers and we're like, okay, how can we address them? So we partnered with in our region something called Easy Lift, where they actually have vans that actually help transport, in particular, folks that use wheelchairs to and from the polls, and that was free. And they could have a companion go with them. We did a whole photography campaign of Black, Latinx, and Indigenous folks talking about why they were voting and what it meant to them, but then also who they were voting for. Because I think sometimes voting seems so abstract. A lot of times you might hear people say, well, this doesn't impact me. It matters then where someone talks about this specific policy. So if we talk about Virginia right now, well, what's being discussed is limits to public records requests. So now we're not able to request as much information about what's happening around policing, right? Or just the policies we talked about earlier today, or governors in Texas, right, who are suggesting that just affirming a trans child is mistreatment, right? These are all reasons why we vote. And again, voting is just a strategy. We need to do many other strategies at once, right? To remind our electeds once they're in office of who they're responsible and accountable to. But I definitely think it is a right that we cannot take for granted, in particular Black folks, where the right to vote is extremely recent. And where we know that so many of our siblings, and I'm specifically wanting to name folks who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated, many of whom have their voting rights restricted, it's important that we show up for them. So I like to think of, we must vote, but also remember who we're voting for.
Just to piggyback on what Simone was saying, it was Dr. King that said that voting is the foundation of political action. In a sense, we can wish for what we want to wish for, what we want to see, but if we don't show up at the ballot box to use our voices, we're in the most singular, powerful way that we can, then we're not going to get the results that we want. Sometimes we still may not get it, but we know for a fact if we don't do everything we can to make sure that we're trying to get the representation that we want, then, at the very least, we sat on the sideline and just kind of, left it up to chance for whatever results happen. And so, voting has been a hot topic issue for, the duration of our country, especially for Black and brown folks. We know about the civil rights movement. We know about how many different tactics were used against us to try to keep us from having our voices heard. And so at the very least, we owe our ancestors who were, murdered or injured or dealt with so many unimaginable things just to try to fight for that right. We owe it to them to use this right that we have and use it well. I had the opportunity to do some voting outreach or voter outreach during the 2020 election. I got in my car, even while I was still obviously having classes virtual nonetheless, and I drove up to Pennsylvania and walked the hills of Pittsburgh, trying to get people to vote and remind them of their election day coming up and where their polling places are, just because I felt like that was the best way that I could utilize my talents and my gifts to be of help and to fight for change. And so we must be steadfast in doing everything we can to ensure that we vote and to ensure that our neighbors vote, because voting has consequences.
And I think also just to uplift again some of the barriers that you were talking about, specifically with transportation, in regards to the Center for Information on Research and Civic Learning and Engagement, 2016, among 18 to 29-year-olds for youth of color, it was 35% stated that lack of transportation was a barrier in comparison to only 27% for white youth. And so just kind of putting a context into some of the barriers that are limiting, especially Black and brown voters. Not only that, but also not having an ID. It was only 15% of white youth in comparison to 30% of youth of color. So again, just kind of emphasizing the importance of why voting is important, so that we can, create policies and create initiatives so that we create more access. So, being able to identify what barriers there are in regards to one of Simone's initiatives that she was saying, and with her organization, creating that access. So being able to find a way to mend that and making sure that we focus on that as well.
Also, to Brianna's point about access, and both Simone and Kevin had highlighted it, in terms of getting the word out, I think word of mouth, especially in Black and brown communities, is very prevalent, is very useful, very resourceful in terms of talk to your neighbor, talk to your cousin, talk to your parents who may be voting for the first time. Go to your congregation, your church, whatever social services organization, your school, in terms of having these conversations about voter access, about how to register, sharing the resources. I think all of us, we have the knowledge in terms of how to vote, how to get the resource to make the best vote for yourself as an individual. And so utilizing that and sharing that knowledge to increase voter turnout among Black and Brown communities.
Thank you. And I think to all of your points that sometimes when we recognize that voting is so important, we sometimes get on the side of stigmatizing those who cannot vote. And we don't recognize that maybe those people want to vote, but they're not able to. Maybe they have transportation issues, or they might be undocumented, or they might have a felony record. And I think it's important to highlight that, even if you wish that you could just vote and get out there, there are other things that you can do. You can spread awareness on social media. You can join a campaign. You can, do your best to get out there, specifically in the marching. You can do lots of things. But I also think that, sometimes people think that Black and Brown people don't vote because they just don't want to. What would you say to those people?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think we all hear that too much, and it can be frustrating. I would say sometimes maybe we don't have to respond, but when we do, right, we can say something like, you know what? It is so much easier to believe and perpetuate this myth, right, that Black and Brown folks don't even want to vote than it would be to really sit with the weightiness of many systems in this country that were built on exclusion and marginalizing Black and Brown folks and minimizing our access to power. That'll be so much easier than saying, how do we make it easier for Black and Brown folks to vote? Or actually have these conversations, right, to talk about what do our social services need to do to actually encourage people to vote. It's definitely one of those things that if we don't actually sit with the question, it doesn't propel us to action. So I would say if you're hearing that myth, one, to disrupt it, but then also remind ourselves, and I think of myself this way too, in that the personal is political, right? We hear that a lot, especially from the women's rights movement, but also Black feminists of the Combahee Collective talked a lot about just wanting to be a Black person and living in our bodies and thriving is political. And so if we think about how often Black people are waking up and wanting to thrive and do well, that in itself is an act of resistance, but it's also an act of affirmation. And if we think of each person engaging in that, each Black person, Brown folks as well too, it's really difficult to then suggest that we are these just passive bystanders who are not engaged in the communities and policies that might be affecting us. So I would say we definitely need to disrupt that myth and look at, like we've already mentioned, transportation. We should look at language justice. Are these different Black and Brown folks who speak a multitude of languages, are they able to access voting in the languages that reminds them of home, right? That their family speaks, that they're most able to understand all of these different concepts, right? Are there folks in their community who are maybe putting up barriers? I know here in the district, we actually brought snacks to the polls because people had to wait hours and hours to vote. But also, there were some people there, actually some of our white allies, who were just observers, right? So to make sure that people weren't being deterred, because there were some folks in the district who were sharing messages that were harmful and really discouraging to Black and Brown folks who were showing up and who wanted to be engaged.
Simone, you preached a word right there. I don't even know how I can follow up on that. Aside from just saying that, like you mentioned, I think that saying this myth that we don't want to vote, it's pretty much just a justification for the different tactics that have occurred or been put into place over the years to make sure that we can't vote as, or be accessible as easily as it should be, I guess you should say. And so at the very least, we just have to make sure that we don't fall into the misinformation, as we saw in the 2016 election and 2020. Misinformation can be dangerous. And so I can't stress enough how important it is to do your own research. Social media is great, but you have to know, the difference. You have to have that discernment when it comes to knowing what information or what sources to go to and believe in before you just, use your vote possibly the wrong way based off of information that is not right. So just, we got to get rid of that myth. We have to do our job to make sure that people know that we want to vote. And in most cases, we end up being the ones that kind of save the country. It's not our responsibility, but It has happened multiple times.
Shout out to Black women in Georgia. You did the thing.
And I think also even going narrower, because this discussion is in regards to emerging Black and Brown voters, social workers, being able to identify the fact that we have a culture of political engagement that dismisses young voters, and where typically in terms of political campaigns, they don't target young people enough. A lot of campaigns are focused on those that have already voted or those that they assume are more likely to vote. And so kind of being able to acknowledge the fact that young people are not in these discussions. We're not being put at the center of it, political engagement, of, being part of that process. And so we have to be able to disrupt that as well and be able to change the culture so that we're also at the center, because at the end of the day, we are the future. And so our engagement with political campaigns should also include us at the foremost, yes.
And I think just in terms of like the myth that Black and Brown people don't vote, specifically talking about the Latinx population, I absolutely think that in these past few elections, we have definitely seen a growth in Latinx voters, and I think we will continue to see that. Just in terms of the people who have immigrated to the United States, particularly from Latin America, who were young, are now reaching voter age. And I think in future generations, such as myself, when I reached voter age, I think we definitely saw a boom, both in the 2016 election, both in the 2020 election. Definitely think we're going to see it in the midterm elections. So yeah, definitely growing population. So I definitely don't think that that's true, and definitely disrupting that myth that Black and Brown voters are increasing and will continue to increase.
And I was just going to add the number of like students, whether it's like 18 to 22 or particular college age, who are part of the reason that we have Black and Brown folks are able to vote in terms of organizers. I know I mentioned before, like Children's Defense Fund, but also Mississippi Freedom Summer, and the number of young folks, Black and Brown folks and white allies who were doing like intergenerational work within freedom schools to talk about what it means to vote, how we show up for our communities. And I know I'm seeing some beautiful comments in the chat from Linda and Leah, like students as well. This impacts us. Like, again, if I'm just thinking, being in the district, but also Virginia right now is having some really tough conversations around what should be taught in schools, right? And what is curriculum that makes people uncomfortable. And that's a whole other conversation, but that impacts young people. So there's like high schoolers, 18-year-olds, this impacts you. Like, if we want to be able to access the truth, to be able to ask critical questions, this is one of the first ways that we get there, right? Exercising our right to vote so that we can make sure when we're in our classrooms, we're having access to the full truth, right? So I just wanted to give gratitude to those students because I appreciate seeing your comments.
So incredibly powerful. And I think one thing that I just started to think about as you all were talking is just, because of redlining, I know in this fellowship, I've had the opportunity to do a lot of research on that. People will go into their specific line and they see other white people. So they come to this conclusion that, well, I'm in line and I don't see Black and Brown people voting, so they must not do it. But in my neighborhood, I saw a lot of Black and Brown people. There was, a number of white people as well, but I didn't move on to this assumption that because I wasn't physically seeing white people, that white people weren't voting. I think I love to challenge people's thought process and how people are just utilizing this confirmation bias that because I'm not seeing it, it must not be happening. So I wanted to think about, what do we do? What is the specific young social work role in this? Like, what can we specifically be doing to challenge these people's beliefs?
Well, I think the most basic thing is to remind ourselves of our code of ethics. I don't know why I did this. I guess like I'm reading the code of ethics from the NASW. And, as a Black woman, I find so much solace as well in the National Association of Black Social Workers, who also has a code of ethics that very specifically calls us to be in community with our kin, to understand at all times who we belong to. And when we're supporting families, for us not to see ourselves as separate from those families that we're supporting. One of those code of ethics even calls us to, sometimes we're going to have to do things outside of our jobs, which might be voting. Because if we think about all these different levels of social work too, whether you're someone who's working directly with persons served, or through someone in macro social work, those are all ways that are serving community. So if you think of our code of ethics, so back again to NASW, a commitment to social justice, or even like to self-determination. Are we voting for policies or welfare policies that support people to make the best choices for themselves? I know right now in the district, our mayor has just approved a pilot program which provides cash benefits to new parents so that they can decide what they need for their household. So if you think about income for new families to make choices, that's not limited to just certain food items or certain types of childcare. This really supports families in real ways to decide what's best for them. And again, thinking about our mayor, that's the result of voting, right? So the first step was parenting people and folks that say they care about parenting people showing up in our polls. And I think as social workers, we definitely need to be the ones leading the charge, or better yet, running for office.
That part. So I think one thing that we need to make sure that we kind of debunk is this idea that social workers are only, people that deal with like child welfare. We deal with so many things, but when people hear social worker, they just think, we're the people that knock on doors and take kids or something like that. And there's no one wants to do that, first and foremost. Let me say that. But secondly, like there's so much more to the field of social work. So visibility is key. We have to make sure that we're, out and about and making noise. I had an opportunity to go down to the White House during, 2020, during the protests. And it was me and a couple of my other social work colleagues. And we had our signs making it, known that we were social work students. And, we're out here trying to do our best to affect change and to get people to vote and to get people to be loud and be heard. So that's the first thing, just making sure that we are engaged in the political process and showing our peers that social workers are out here and we are passionate about doing everything in our power and using our skill set to change the world, essentially. And as someone who did run for office back in 2018, it was the social work education, because I originally started at Howard in the School of Social Work back in 2015. It was that passion that I got from the professors that I had, and that encouragement to just get out there and just go for it. I was terrified when I ran for office for the first time, but I knew that I had something to say, and I knew that volunteering my time and volunteering my services to the community was well within the code of ethics. And so I couldn't go wrong regardless of the way that the election turned out. So those are two impactful ways. Just let your voice be heard and don't be afraid to jump out there and encourage others to do the same.
And I think also even going back to just the simple act of just talking, starting a conversation within your family, within your friends, it starts with awareness. It starts with having those discussions. Again, I know, Thanksgiving gatherings can be difficult when we're talking about politics, but again, that's how we stimulate those discussions. That's how we figure out what issues are important to us in ways that we can find, political candidates that align with the kind of decisions that we want to have implemented today. And so I think at the end of the day, just start having that discussion. It's really as simple as that. It's just starting to talk about it.
And yeah, just kind of going off Brianna, yes, talking about it, just in terms of being able to share those resources. I know specifically with my cousins, and now we're all of voting age, and all adults will be able to have those insightful discussions. And it's so nice and comforting to be able to have those discussions with my the older generation, my aunts, my uncles, my parents, even, who may not be able to vote, but are able to also engage in those conversations and take those conversations into other places and have their kids or their grandkids even be able to have those conversations. Because I think everyone should be educated in terms of what political candidates are in office, what current issues are being discussed. And so I think it's definitely a wonderful thing to see, and just in terms of being able to talk about it and share that knowledge.
Thank you all for sharing. And, at this time, I would definitely like to acknowledge all the Howard University students that I've been seeing in the chat. And I would love to invite you all to please ask some questions. We want to make sure that your voices are heard as well as ours, because, this is what it's all about. And as well to all of NASW, we want to get your questions in. FYI, great documentary Fannie Lou Hamer on the PBS Front Line, historically Black voting right organizer in Mississippi in the 60s. Totally inspiring. Thank you, Mimi. We really appreciate that. I definitely will have to give that a look shortly.
And I'm even just thinking, going back to the prior question we had, or maybe it wasn't a question, but it's just what we were talking about, of like, why do we vote and how does this impact us? I'm just reminded too, we're really lucky. Hopefully, if you're already watching this platform, then you're following NASW, because NASW, right, has policy priorities too, right? So if you're like, okay, how does this align with my values or my profession? How might this impact me? I know when I was putting together the one pager for this, that was something that I immediately went to. And so just on the website for NASW, I was able to see policy briefs, but just gather information about the Affordable Care Act integration, about child welfare, about Medicare reimbursement, Older Americans Act, social worker safety, student loan forgiveness. We're all students. That is a major one. Social Work Reinvestment Act. So that was helpful for me just to think of like, okay, why does this matter in my profession? And then again, just going back to social workers who are in office. Last year, as a part of Social Work Day on the Hill, many different students from different social work campuses, right, including like Brianna, as she and I were able to speak to some of our Congress folks, including reps for Barbara Lee, as well as Karen Bass, about issues that impact us as social work students. So again, I mean, there's all these reasons why we should vote, but also why it's incredibly urgent to do so.
So I have a question to all of you. And, social workers have real hard conversations. So we're going to have some real hard conversations right now. The fact that most of the voter suppression is occurring in brown and Black spaces, what do you say to your white social work colleagues who are listening? How do they help you or assist in these communities?
I can go ahead and take the lead on that. I would say the first place to go is to look at the ethical standards on the NASW website. Go to 6.02. It says public participation. Social workers should facilitate informed participation by the public in shaping social policies and institutions. It is part of our work as social workers. It is not exclusive to Black and Brown social workers. It's not excluded to Black and Brown voters or the population overall. It's every social worker's duty to go ahead and assist in that process of making sure that people are informed. And then in addition to that, kind of tying back to our principles as social workers, service, social justice, dignity and worth of a person. Those are things that, we should already embody. And those are things that we should take in, especially for white social workers, to use in their practice and in how they engage with other people. So in terms of, social justice, for example, we have voter suppression. We see it there. There's instances throughout the nation in regards to where we're seeing it. One of the best ways that white social workers can engage in social justice work for this is helping to go ahead and pass John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2021. That would be one of the first steps in terms of being able to take those actions.
I couldn't agree more. I think the first thing is just realizing their privilege. That's number one, because once there's an understanding that there's privilege, then everything else kind of falls into place, as far as just understanding that sometimes we could say the same thing, or they can say the same thing that we said, and it's received differently because of that privilege. And so if you really want to be an ally, you have to understand the historical trauma that we've dealt with, not just when it comes to like voting and the fight for voting rights, but everything. Just like you would if you were dealing with a client and you were trying to understand the best way to help them, and the best way to increase their level of self-determination. So just understanding their privilege, and using that privilege to be of use, and keeping an open mind, and really trying to understand us, and understand what it is that we're asking for and advocating for.
I want to piggyback off of what you said, Kevin, because I want to highlight a Black woman. Her name is Crystal Mason. She was actually sentenced to 5 years in prison for not realizing that she didn't have the right to vote. So to white social workers, I would say to do your homework and, research why, you might not be seeing Black people in your specific areas, why you might not be seeing Hispanic people in your specific areas. Recognizing the privileges that you have are important, especially when we are doing micro level practice. And also Black people in general, we face harder sentencing practices than white folks who are committing the exact same crime. So my sentiment is always to do your homework, make sure that we're encouraging each other to do continued education.
Yeah, and I would just add, we're really lucky in this moment. I know especially just thinking about millennials, we're lucky to be able to learn like as much as we can from like Instagram, social media, all of this stuff. All of that to say that I think Black and brown folks are talking so publicly on these platforms. The least that we can do, right, is encourage and engage with that content. So when I think of white social workers, the bare minimum would be to like listen to Black and brown social workers that you were in community with. But I think the other part is really utilizing and leveraging your positionality, right? I think a lot at Howard, we talk about moving from case advocacy, so how you might advocate for an individual that you're serving, to cause advocacy, because what that person is experiencing is likely not something that is unique to them, but actually, right, the result of many systems that have been designed to create scarcity and to marginalize them. And so what would it look like when you're supporting someone who's trying to access social services, to start thinking about, how might this require me to be involved in systems change, so that we can help more families, more communities, and again, remind ourselves of who we belong to, because each of us are just so focused on serving an individual person, right? We're missing a much wider system that needs to be disrupted. And so I would say, to kind of make that connection, I guess, is the connection from micro to macro social work, but also, from case advocacy to cause advocacy as well.
I would also even say, kind of to uplift Kevin's statement in terms of allyship, having white social workers be active throughout the whole process. And I'm not just talking about in registering to vote, but also in terms of uplifting Black and brown social workers' voices, as well as their own voices, I would even say, even to like the day of voting, where they're able to cast their vote, but also even after the fact, where depending on, regardless of what candidate won, in terms of being open and being honest in terms of what candidate they voted for, why they supported them. And so just being active throughout the whole entire process, because at the end of the day, like, every vote really does matter and does count, as we have seen in these past few elections.
And I was just going to uplift, I see in the chat, Judith is mentioning that this year's Student Advocacy Day is being organized by Johnson C. Smith University. So thank you for sharing that and for reminding us of that. And then Melina, I see that you actually asked us a question. So how do you think students and youth can become more engaged on a macro level to advocate for minority voting rights? So I definitely have some things that I'm thinking of just as a grassroots organizer, but I want to make sure that some of my colleagues are able to respond as well. So would one of you want to start with responding to Marlena's question?
So I actually had the pleasure of having a brief chat with her. We do some IFSW work on top of our internships and all of that jazz. It's been a great and pleasure speaking with you previously. I think on a macro level, since I am a CAP student, which is Community Administration and Policy, in order to advocate for minority voting rights, I think we would be understanding the strategies of how we advocate towards youth in particular. I think that old school handing out flyers and doing that level of engagement is always important. I'm one to make a poster. I love a poster. But I think specifically if we're engaging with students and we're engaging with youth, we need to be focusing more towards social media advocacy. I think that social media, I think maybe we all don't want to admit that we use it more than we do. I definitely have been limiting my screen time as of late. You can do that on settings now. But the fact of the matter is we are there a lot. So if we can be posting Instagram posts, we can be posting Facebook posts, we can be doing Twitter and all of that, you're more likely to get students to see that based on our age cohort.
And all this time in there, whatever your sphere of influence is, use it. Because I think sometimes we think that we have to be super degreed to make an impact on macro level policies, and that's not true. I would say you could get a group of you and 5 friends together, and maybe you host a town hall. Like something we did in California is we wanted to write a youth policy agenda, right? And we wanted to write a policy agenda centering Black folks. And so we created a list of questions, 5 questions that we asked every single person that was running for city council and mayor. We showed all of those answers in their entirety. We couldn't say we endorse or don't know this person. We could say, this is how they responded when we asked them about police oversight. This is how they responded when we asked for them to create actionable policies that respond to gentrification, right? And it responded to what young people were asking, so it was relevant. But then we found partners in our area. So whether it was like League of Women Voters, or in our area, there was a group of laity and clergy called CLUE. And we were like, can we host a town hall together? Can be on Instagram or Facebook, wherever people are plugged in, and ask these people the questions. We did that for folks who wanted to be hired as the police chief, but also folks who were running for sheriff. Because again, if we think about young people being policed in very specific ways, it was important for us to let young people as elected, so people who were asking for their votes, well, how are you going to police me? What does this look like? How do you define safety? And is it the same way that I do, right? Do you have my positionality in mind? So I would say, please don't wait. Please don't think that you need to have all of these like letters behind your name to be involved in macro policy. You can leverage your area of influence. That's something that I was really, really excited to do in my area, and it can be replicated. You just get their emails. It's public information. Go to the website, send them an email, ask those questions. Say there's 6 of us from my school or my department would like to host a forum around this. And most electeds will come. They want your vote. So they want a chance to be able to try out what their response is, right? So don't delay. I would say start doing that now.
Just to piggyback on Karessa's point about social media, like I don't consider myself to be old. I'm still pretty youthful, but my kids they're on social media all the time, more than I would rather them be on, but they are so good at navigating it. And so I'm just like, my kids are still 11, 10, and then my twins are 8. And if they're able to navigate Instagram and TikTok and all of those platforms right now the way that they do, imagine what they could use those platforms for when it comes to things like policy related issues and trying to get the word out for things. So one thing we have to make sure that we're not falling in the trap of saying, oh, well, you're too young. We talked about not having letters behind your name and feeling like you're not qualified with that. But let's talk about the age thing. At the end of the day, these different laws that are put into place, different legislation and all that, they affect everybody. It doesn't matter whether you can vote or not. Healthcare affects everybody. So we have to make sure that we're not, telling our children that, hey, yeah, your opinion doesn't matter on this particular issue because you're not 18 yet. That's ridiculous. If democracy is supposed to be, so beloved and we want a strong democracy, then knowledge has to be acquired as soon as possible. Not when you become 18. You should be well versed on these things that are affecting your lives. And so just making sure that people are given that information as young as possible. Also, if we're talking about, like high school age kids or below, field trips. Everyone has a state capital. So you may not be like us and have access to, the mayor's office and, the seat of the most powerful government in the world, but you do have a government seat that you can go visit and, put boots on the ground and show up. And as someone who interned for a couple members of Congress, there's nothing more uncomfortable than having some angry constituents at your door looking for you, trying to find out why you voted the way you voted, or just trying to encourage you to vote on a particular piece of legislation a certain way. So it does help. Show up and be in their face. Kids are great at that.
So Amani and Leah want to know some of the grassroots activities that maybe you all have done or think could be done.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the sum that I shared, right, was writing our policy agenda, but also crafting questions. So we asked Black community members, like, what do you want to know? What are you curious about? And then we promised and had to make sure we then followed through on what those questions are to our electeds. Like I mentioned, we did a whole photo campaign because especially on Instagram, there might be people who aren't really wanting to engage with a long post, but a visual, right, of Black and brown folks in solidarity with each other. Maybe in ours that we use like body paint or images of specific things to show like, this is why I'm voting. This is why I'm like showing out. The other thing in our area in particular, there was a push around ethnic studies. So we had a lot of young people saying, I've never had a Black teacher. I've never had an Indigenous teacher. There were some that had some Latinx teachers, but it was few, right? And so what we did in those conversations, besides first thanking like young folks for like asking those questions aloud so that we could hear them, was like, you know what? We can start having that question at the school board. Because again, there's all of these different levels of political engagement. And once you show up to a school board meeting, it's so much easier to show up to a city council meeting, right? And then a board of supervisors meeting. And even though you might be nervous at first, because you usually get like 90 seconds to say all the things you want to say, it's really good practice. Also, I think it reminds our electeds, again, of who they're responsible to and who their policies actually impact. So it's much different for a school board member to talk about hiring policies in the abstract, but then to actually hear from high schoolers who say, I have never had a Black teacher and I'm going to graduate in a year. Right? That's much more impactful than to just say, oh, we haven't hired any Black teachers this year. We're going to have it in our 3-year plan, right? Which is typically what happens. And I think the other part of Amani's question was, what are some things that come up? And often just in organizing, I hear a lot of other young people, even some of the people that I organize and love, right? Just tell me they're not voting because it doesn't matter. And the thing that I always try to do, and again, what I think is part of us as social workers, is I never try to shame folks or pass judgment. I always try to ask questions. Like, I hear that, and I see that you feel really strongly about it. Can you tell me more about that? And oftentimes what I've heard is like a sense of like helplessness, a feeling of, I'm just one in so many. So then I can have conversations about like, well, how can we talk to your family? How can we talk to your friends? How can we make this a community? So I think what I hear a lot is, young people saying it's not something they want to engage in. But when we sit with young people, also as young folks and social workers ourselves, and ask deeper questions, then we can come back to maybe this person is needing support, maybe needing encouragement, or maybe just needing models. So of other people who are able to connect how all of these things and policies impact them, right? Because again, what I keep trying to say, right, is like the personal is political. So it's not possible for someone to be like, I'm not in politics. Even people who say that is not true. Because it's like, where do you live? Where did you go to school? Do you have kids or not? All of that is political. All of that is impacted by these systems. So it's not something we can opt out of. So I would just say it's really an opening when we hear these things like voting doesn't matter to sit and have a deeper conversation, to exercise our social worker skills.
And I wanted to make sure I answered my dear friend Imani's question. You know, for me, especially with the internship that I have at NASW, I do a lot of fact sheets. So I've been collecting information, doing additional research to make sure that I'm getting that information out there to other people. So for the first one that I've done, which is actually one of my first tasks when I was starting at NASW, was to research voter suppression in terms of each population. So I did some research on Indigenous people. I did research on African Americans, Latinx folks. I did research on Asian Americans, just to make sure that we were highlighting how all of our experiences are connected and how we've all had the experience of telling people that, you know, we can't vote. You know, it was a big charge that I was involved in. And I also got to help create some slides because Professor Joyner, specifically, her theme for her presidency is surrounding voting. So I was able to help, you know, get that message out there. You know, I fixed a couple photos up and it was a really great experience.
So I want to try to touch on both Imani and Leah's questions just a little bit. So Imani's was related to grassroots efforts. So both, of course, during my time in Pittsburgh during the last election, that was an eye-opening experience. You know, going up there in territory I was not familiar with at all, and knocking on doors and hoping I did not get chased off or something. But you know, that experience was great. And you know, Pennsylvania ended up being one of the last states, if not the last state, that basically decided the election. And so, you know, watching the election that night and knowing that I was a part of getting, you know, a Howard alumni or alumna across the threshold was powerful. It was an experience that I'll always remember. During my own campaign, from a grassroots level, what I ran into in the district that I was running in was a lot of people had never seen their representative, and so it highlights a problem that occurs in a lot of districts where Black and brown people are the minority in the district. And so if you have a candidate that is, you know, not Black or brown, they tend to use their resources only in the amount of the constituencies that they need to target in order for them to ensure that they win. And so they don't see that candidate in the Black and brown community because our votes aren't needed, honestly, is what it comes down to. And so it's an unfortunate thing, but it was an eye-opening experience for me. And it informs the way that I go about my social work career, because I was able to experience that firsthand and that mistrust that comes. Obviously, the many shootings that we've seen, the officer-related shootings, that does not only affect our trust in law enforcement, it also affects trust in the entire system. So if you continue to see these injustices happen, you're probably not going to want to vote because you don't think the government cares about you at all at any level. And so obviously, you know, it's understandable that people don't want to vote for that reason. In terms of Leah's question, as far as like what social work students can do, when we think of like student council presidents and all of the people that sit on the student council, typically those offices only focus on things within the School of Social Work. I've challenged you to be more active outside of those walls. So creating a position paper or making positions on certain topics, and then going down to the seat of the government, wherever that may be, and testifying and getting your professors behind you and figuring out ways to amplify your voices now. You don't have to wait until you graduate to become an expert on, what you're trying to do. Like, you live the experience every day, so you know what you're passionate about. So get out there immediately and do something about it.
Kevin, one thing that I wanted to say is currently you're watching the school boards really kind of want to strip all information out that relates to brown and black people. And I know that there is a school of social work in everyone. I always say that social workers need to be at the school board meetings and to give testimony to why we need to have an inclusive curriculum. And what we're hearing from people who are white supremacists, but we're not hearing social work voices. And I don't care whether it's brown, black, indigenous, Asian, Pacific, social workers, right? Social workers could take over those places. So as we're, I know Karessa is going to be winding down, but before I want to get this one question in. If you were in my position, president of NASW, what would you say to the 10,000 members that belong to the organization? And that's for all of you to just think about and answer. So we just elected you president of NASW, and now you have to give your speech. And we're in these times that are so divisive. And Whitney Young was part of that Voting Rights Act. He made sure it got over and kind of advised 3 presidents about voting rights. What would you say to all the membership and even to just social workers about what their role is now at this time? The time is right for social work, but is social work ready for these times? What would you say?
So I would say, just in terms of the importance of, and part of being a social worker is being dedicated to being a lifelong learner. Always be open to learning opportunities, always have an open mind, always share the resources and the wealth and knowledge that you have as an individual, but definitely the importance of being a dedicated lifelong learner. There's a reason that once we are certified, we have to do our continuing education credits, because we always have to be informed. Policy is constantly changing, laws are constantly changing. So just be informed, be in the know, and share that knowledge.
And I think for me, I'm big on macro level practice. That is what I'm studying. But I think we also need to make sure that micro, meso, and macro are coming together. I think, we focus on, we're all so different, but truly in any profession that you do, you have to use every single one of those pieces. And I think that making sure that we are calling other people to action and making sure that we are all coming together is a big piece that I always want to focus on, because I love talking to you all. I love having these conversations, but I also want to make sure that we're stressing the actual action pieces, especially with everything that we're doing.
I think I would be like, wow, thank you, Professor Joyner. This is amazing. I think after that, just in gratitude for Howard, would remind folks about the beauty of the Black perspective and how as social workers, we have inherited a really nuanced legacy of the ways that social work in many ways has impacted the most marginalized people, and sometimes in really harmful ways. But I'm grateful for the Black perspective, but also just Black pioneers of social work who really visioned new ways of practice that we haven't even fully implemented yet. So I think at this imagined, presidential speech, I might mention some of those Black pioneers. I might mention the growing field of abolitionist social work. And I would also really, really want to have conversations, really complicating and having, critical analysis around mandated reporting. But this new idea I've heard lately, which is called mandated support. So how do we use policies and practices, again, like all of our social welfare knowledge, and think about these Black social work pioneers and what it looks like to provide mandated support? Because I think so often we're responding to things and we're not doing the macro side, right? Which is creating an environment that is actually just equitable in the way that we build it. So I would definitely stress that.
I would say for myself, the first thing that I'd want to say to all the social workers is, with everything going on with the pandemic, I know a lot of us are exhausted. We've been, exhausting all of our resources, all of our energy. And with everything that's going on recently with the news, along with just everything else that has been going on in the past few years, if you feel some type of way, this is your sign, this is your affirmation that yes, you are needed. This is why you are here, to undo the injustices that are going on right now. Use this as a way to uplift yourself and affirm why you are a social worker, that your work is important, because you can see, with the things that are going on the past couple days, this is why we are here. This is why social workers are important. And just kind of using this platform to go ahead and also extend that, because we are important, because we're here doing the hard work, let's also make sure that we're voting. Let's make sure that we're letting other people know how to vote, because these are the issues that we are trying to solve. We are trying to create a more social and equitable world. And in order to do that, it starts with the people that are representing us. And so that's how I'd go ahead and respond to that question. And also to kind of lead into the next portion of what do we do next, especially for young social workers. What does that require? What can we do? I know I actually want to uplift a comment that Linda had made earlier. She had said, I absolutely agree and love your answer about the town halls. I would love a social work education focused on encouraging students to take this initiative. As you have said, social work is political. And kind of in tangent with Leah's question in regards to what strategies can we use in social work education, I would challenge you to use your field education. Use your field practicum, and set aside hours so that you're doing work that involves voter registration, that involves work with understanding policies, or being able to uplift your clients to get the knowledge of, constituencies that are related to the issues that they, are dealing with. And I think also in addition to that, I want to make sure that credit is going in the right direction. Voting is social work. They have a lot of resources that I highly suggest that we look at in regards to being able to have resources for not only students, but field educators, for social work agencies, and also for faculty, in different ways that we can go ahead and start strategizing and start actually implementing and doing the hard work of, uplifting voter rights and making sure that we're informed. Ways that we can do this as students. So, of course, if you have an email or you got a pen and paper, the easiest way is go ahead, send a letter to your congresswoman or congressman and let them know of the issues that you are concerned about. That's something that we've all been aware of. There's other ways that we can go ahead and do it. We can also go ahead and make sure pledging to vote ourselves. It starts with ourselves and being able to model our own behavior by going ahead and starting off there. And then also doing our research. So again, other resources, Black Voters Matter, as well as Voto Latino, they have a lot of information in regards to resources on main issues that people are typically concerned about. And so going ahead, getting that information, not only for yourself, but so that you can have conversations with family members, friends, your clients, and going ahead and starting with those initiatives. I think that's a great way to start. I think also some of the things that my colleagues had mentioned was also social media campaigns. There's so many different ways that we can go ahead and start the work. And it really it all depends on your imagination at the end of the day. So as social workers, that's easy for us. We got this.
How am I supposed to follow that? Like, my speech probably won't be anywhere near as eloquent as either of those speeches. But basically, I mean, I would just say, be a sponge. As a social worker, you're a jack of all trades, or a Jill of all trades, or whatever. And so part of the reason why I decided to do the dual degree with the business school was because I wanted to be able to have an understanding of how the business industry could be married with social work in order to make the different changes that need to be made to affect positive change. So never be afraid to go out here and find out about other industries that you can partner with in order to get the results that you want. No, that does not mean you always have to take out more student loans and apply to another, degree program, but, just word of mouth, talk to people, find out what makes their industry tick and see how they could be of use. Because as a social worker, it takes a village. That saying might be cliche, but it is real. It takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village to help a client. And so use those resources and always be willing to learn something new. Or what else? I mean, you all pretty much took my speech, but no, just always be willing to be open to new opportunities. And also, part of the reason why I started my nonprofit was because I felt like there were some things missing from like other organizations that I had experiences with. So never be ashamed or never be afraid to use your entrepreneurial spirit and get out here and implement some things that not only will help people, but, also help you, because we all have to eat at the end of the day. Do not be ashamed of making money as a social worker. You don't have to be, impoverished just to care about people. It's okay. So that's probably what I would tap in on as the newly elected president of NASW.
Yeah, I don't have anything. I was really just going back to what Brianna was saying, like, how do we get this information? Where can we start? And of course, it's sharing resources, but I think just, again, like thinking of our role as social workers, also the people that we support. So for a long time, I was a case manager for folks with disabilities. And something that became a regular part of my job was hosting workshops on getting registered to vote. Now, there are not often people, when we like erase people with disabilities, but we often don't think of folks with disabilities as also voters. But all of these things impact them as well. So again, I would say, on who are you serving? Are you serving parenting people? Are you serving pregnant people? Are you serving lower income families? Are you serving folks living in affordable housing? How can you think creatively about your job duties to make voting accessible to them, right? Like, what would it look like to have a drive at that place, right? Or to like send that home. I know the school social worker for my daughter uses like Parent Square to encourage parents, right? That she's supporting as families, right? I think sometimes we have to think creatively and expansively about our roles as social workers, because there is always a way to meet this need. But also there's always partners who can support us. So yes, we want to go out and get this information, want to remind people that this information is accessible, but also in each of our roles, we should be creating opportunities for the folks we serve to have access to that information directly so that they can also exercise their right to vote.
Sasha, were you going to say something? I know, or okay. Go, if go ahead, Karessa.
I was going to say, you know what, this conversation has just been so amazing, but we do not have too much time left. So I wanted to, give us a space for any closing remarks that we have.
Well, my closing remark is, I'm so proud of all of you. Your knowledge, your values, your skills, your commitment to the code of ethics is one that knows that our future is bright. Far too often, there's this rumor going around that we're in trouble because the younger generation is not engaged. But if we look at our history, as was so eloquently done by Simone, young people have always been engaged in voting, and they will continue to be engaged. They will continue to be elected to offices. You will continue to be NASW presidents. You'll continue to carry on the legacy that we had of Whitney Young, and of all social workers. As you said, Simone, the social work, the NASW pioneers, and to people who aren't even social workers. And I think that that's what it's all about in social work. Let's kick out those silos and engage all people to bend that arc of justice towards equity for all. That's what's most important. I know Dr. Gourdine is smiling down from her resting place because her Howard students have hit it out of the park. And so I want to say to Karessa, who's the NASW intern, thank you. To all of you as fellows, I know you are social justice change agents, and no matter what you do, you will always use your social work skills to make sure that the most vulnerable people in our society have equity. Yes, we may have Governor Abbott and DeSantis who's trying to tear up things, but I see Governor Robinson, Governor Thomas, I see a Simone, a senator, Sasha out there working, maybe a Supreme Court justice. And Karessa, of course, you are just going to be leading it all, maybe sitting in the White House, right? That is the future that we have. So, as we said, let's get rid of all those rumors. Brown and Black people don't vote, brown and Black people don't care, and turn it into the strength that brown and Black people always show up. But we will show up with our white allies who must be as committed as we are to bend that arc of justice towards equity for all. So that's my ending.
And I don't have any comments other than to say thank you so much, Professor Joyner. Thank you to the NASW. And then also, of course, we're here on a historic day, right? Because we know that Miss Brown Jackson has been nominated to the Supreme Court. So it's just all of the beautiful, positive things that are happening. So just gratitude to all of the folks behind the scenes as well to help make this happen. And I'm like, can we say thank you to Miss Brown Jackson for being nominated today and just adding some joy, because we definitely needed some joys and some reminders of Black liberation, especially today. So that's all I have, but thank you, everyone.
And I want to make sure that we are ending on an appropriate time. So just thank you so much to all of you for being with us today and sharing your voices.
And join us next month when we'll talk about generations in social work. Okay, in March. So thank you. Bye, everyone. Have a nice day and go take action. Do something today that will either stop voter suppression, voter nullification, and gets out the right to vote. Bye-bye, y'all.